Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Dr. Psych Mom Show. I'd like everybody to subscribe, as you know, because I talk about that all the time. So please click on the link to subscribe, and then you're going to get bonus episodes. And also, I have a cool Facebook group that is growing and growing, and it's a secret/private group, so your friends and family can't see you comment on all my articles about oral sex or that you feel like a bad mom or whatever. So that is preferable. People have asked me over the years for that, and it's like $4.99 a month. People have asked if there's a way to bundle the subscriptions. No, because one is on Anchor and one is on Facebook. So sorry about that, but each of them is worthwhile. So thank you if you have subscribed to one of them, and if not, subscribe to both of them. And if you've subscribed to neither of them, then subscribe. What's stopping you? Tell me what you want out of a paid subscription service and I will deliver it. Anyhow, today we are going to talk about an easy way to enhance your communication with your spouse that most people don't do, even though it's so easy. And reminded me today to make a podcast about this because I was talking to my son, and I'm very proud because my son is going to the nationals for a geography tournament, and we're talking about some Middle Eastern country, and he's telling me about the GDP, and I said, why is the GDP so high? And he says, well, and then he starts like obviously talking out of his ass. He's 8 years old. He's very smart, but he doesn't know everything, And I'm like, you really didn't know. So instead of trying to make stuff up, we could look it up. But why don't you just say something that is like good question? I said, don't you feel good if your teacher says to you, good question? And he said, yeah. So I said, well, say it. Say, good question, mommy. So he says, good question, mommy. So later then he said it again. It was funny because we were talking about something else. And then he remembered it and he said, good question. So anyway, saying good question or good point are very easy insertions into whatever you usually say to your spouse that leads to problems. Doesn't everybody like to be told they have a good point? This in and of itself can be transformative in a conversation. You're talking to somebody, they say something you don't agree with, but nobody is totally stupid, right? There's a point, there's a point to what they said. It's not your perspective, but it could be a good point. Similarly, if you don't know the answer to something, instead of backpedaling, a lot of guys do this in particular, like backpedaling and giving some other, let's go macro 40,000 foot view, I'll tell you some other shit I know about, because basically what men do is they try to seem smart. This is like women bond over who is doing worse, and men bond over like who's better, and they tease the ones who are stupid, right? So women aren't like that. So men in particular like to seem smart. This is how they're socialized. They like to seem that they know things. So not to be a dick, they don't do it, but just their automatic is to think of an answer, even if they don't know. Sometimes when they're talking, they do think of an answer. Great. But your wife, and your wife's usually the one that has problems with this behavior, she knows that you're kind of making shit up on the fly. And so she doesn't really respect that. What she would like much more than you being smart, and I write this in my Devil's Advocate article, why not to play Devil's Advocate with your wife, and I could link you to that. But she likes you to be kind and to give her something positive about her. Say something nice about her. So if you're talking to your wife and you totally disagree with her on something, and so let's say you say, I think that we should go to Florida. And she says, I don't think that we should go to Florida because it's very hot. It's too hot for a baby. You're thinking babies are born in Florida every minute. But instead you might say, good point. I think it would be fine. You have a point. I do want to go somewhere warm. So, why don't we think about like what would work for both of us? That goes so much better because your wife feels like you heard her finally, and because you said it's a good point, instead of saying it's a bad point, which is what it does when you argue. And if she feels good about herself, she's much more willing to play ball on any conversation, and also she's much more likely to be happy and affectionate in general. Similarly, good question makes somebody feel good about having asked something instead of you answering it like they were stupid or backpedaling in the aforementioned way that I talked about where you just make up any answer out of your ass. So, for example, if you're talking to your husband and and it's something like about the kids, and let's say so many men feel marginalized in the input that they give about the kids, like that their wife just deeply does not give a shit what they think and is going to do whatever she wants, and that is really not a good dynamic in any regard for any topic. And so I use it because it's common. So let's say that you're a man, let's say your wife is what you perceive as a helicopter parent, and she kind of does everything with the kids, entire purview, whatever you try to do, she basically tells you is wrong. This is not an uncommon dynamic. It's called maternal gatekeeping. But so if you're a wife and your husband has in any way indicated that he feels that you don't take his input with the kids, I mean, he's probably right? So if you want to have a happier marriage, when he says something, let's say you have the schedule down to a science. You could do a dissertation on how to schedule your kids' after school activities. And then he says something like, why doesn't Johnny have an art class? He's really into art. Usually you might turn and say, yeah, because I don't have a clone of myself that could drive his ass to art class when you don't understand how minutely down to the microsecond I have scheduled all of this stuff. So that's why he can't have an art class, and maybe he could have a coloring book, right? So instead of saying that, you could say, good question. I know he is into art, but the thing is, I can't really schedule too much stuff. Do you have any ideas on how we could give him an art class? And if your husband feels like you said good question and that it is a good question and you actually think that it's a good question, because it's a good question, maybe he noticed Johnny's into art and you are so consumed with the other things that you didn't notice as much that he is. So then your husband's going to be more on board. Maybe he could be like, well, maybe we could do this, on the weekend. Or I would drive him, I would find something, in which case you'd be like, good, find something, totally, take it over. Right? So if you say good point or good question, that in and of itself changes the frame. So many people do this at work, and then at home they stop on a dime. They don't do it ever again once they enter their house. They may do it for their kids. God knows people do it too much with their kids. Your kid could say the sky is blue and you're like, oh my God, he's going to be a wonderful scientist. It's such a great point. You break out the video camera and you tell him to say it again so you have it for posterity when he wins the Nobel Prize. But the husband could say something like, I wonder why, this on your paycheck takes out this much taxes, and he realizes that you're being underpaid by $500, and you'd be like, yeah, well, it's nice that you finally looked at my paycheck. It's so different, right? We very rarely acknowledge the good things in our spouse, but constantly heap the praise on our children. We should just really chill the fuck out with both of those things, making them moderate. So stop insulting your spouse so much covertly or overtly, and stop praising the kid for wiping himself, and go somewhere in the middle with both so that you could recognize some positive comments that everybody says. And this creates a culture in the home, by the way, of positivity. If very little kids hear you say good point, they're going to start to say good point. Remember all those other things that they say that you've caught them saying that are the bad things that you say, such as cursing or saying things obnoxiously or sighing and rolling your eyes. You see your kids do all the stuff you do. At least if you open your eyes to it, you see it, and it doesn't feel good. It's usually the bad stuff that they start to mimic. So give them some good things. Say good point, and don't be afraid to prompt and direct children very, very directly and instructively how to say something. And they do it. So it's like what I've said before. If you come home and you say, oh, sweetheart, how was your day, to your tween daughter, and she looks at you and then she looks back at her phone, you go over and you say, how was your day, Mom? And she'll do it, especially if she knows you're going to take the phone. And eventually she'll start just doing it, because that's how people are when they learn a new trick and when they're told how to do it. If you have a home where you ask your kids how they are all the time and they never ask you, they literally don't know how. You think that they know how from watching what you do to them, but you do a lot of shit for them that they don't do back. So they don't even know. Literally, they don't even know that children ask their parents how the parents are too. They don't know. So you have to instruct them. Similarly to how I instructed Levi to say, good question, mommy. So now he says, good question. And then I said, like people like to hear this. And then there's some kid in his class that is older than him that he likes, as a looks up to a little bit. And I said, wouldn't you feel good if such and such kid, if you were talking and he said, good point, Levi? He said, yeah, but he never says that. I said, yeah, I know. But wouldn't you feel good, if he did? And you could make somebody feel that good by saying good point or good question, right? And so this is a really good thing, especially if you're in a dynamic. So many people are, especially if you're in the Mr. Perfect and his crazy wife dynamic, which I could link you to. In addition to the devil's advocate. A lot of Mr. Perfects play devil's advocate, by the way. No shock. If you are in a situation where you're a man and your wife always thinks that you're out-thinking her, out-talking her, out-arguing her, you think you're so smart, blah, blah, right? She is yearning for you to acknowledge that she has a good point or a good question. This is going to increase your chances of getting laid by 1 million and of just your wife feeling good about herself, which that indirectly influences your odds of getting laid and just of having a happy wife, happy life. So if usually, let's say you're in charge of all the finances and think about it like this. If you're in charge of the finances, right, you're figuring out if you're going to refinance your house. And I know there's women who do the finances. I do the finances, by the way. You guys are not introducing me to a new dynamic in the world. It's just that the majority, and I speak to the majority as should people who have a majority that they see. More people, it's relevant that the man does the finances. So that's going to be my example. You're a captive audience, so you could either click off because you're so offended, or you could just listen. So if you're a man who does the finances, let's say you're refinancing your house, and your wife comes over and she says, but, why can't we just ask for a lower rate? A lot of guys are going to roll their eyes, be like, oh yeah, well, wouldn't that be nice? And maybe blah, blah, blah. But if their kid came over, their 8-year-old, and was like, hey, why don't we just ask for a lower rate? They'd be like, good question, Johnny. That's a great question. But here's how all of the financial markets and capitalism work. And boy, are you going to go into finance one day? You're such a bright kid. Right? But then to your wife, you're going to roll your eyes and make it so much less likely that she ever asks you a question about anything in your purview again. And then you know what's the funny part? You're going to complain. I do everything around here. I do all the finances. She don't even know how much money we make. Right? But if she asks, you're an asshole. This happens so much with budgeting and all sorts of things. The woman has not been used to doing this, or you can flip the gender. Remember, if you're in the inverse situation, they're not used to doing it. You want them, you wish, you fantasize that they would split the burden with you. But the first time they ask what you perceive as a stupid question, which is anything that doesn't come right out of a Wharton professor's mouth, honestly, if you're real with yourself, then you say, well, maybe you would know if blah, blah. Well, what is that going to get you? Absolutely nothing. So when your spouse asks what you think is a stupid question, act like you would if it was your kid. If it was your kid, you'd probably think it was a smart question. And you know what? For somebody who has no idea about something, they're like a child in that area. So if you want to build on their enthusiasm, answer their question nicely. And if you want even bonus points, say it's a good question. Because any question is a good question. If somebody's stepping out of their comfort zone and trying to ask something, your wife probably had to build up some balls to ask you about why don't we just ask for a lower rate. Even if you think it's the stupidest question in the world, she has interacted with you for so long. She knows you're going to think it. So apparently she had to build up some nerve to even ask you. So reward that by saying it's a good question, and you will perhaps then get a wife who's really interested in sharing the burden of the finances with you if she's incrementally exposed to how they work in a loving and supportive way that you would if your kid asked the same question. Okay, so hopefully this made you think about this different. This is one you could start today. Some of my stuff, planning a date night, that takes a little time. Learning 15 ways to help your highly sensitive wife want sex, that takes a little time. This one you could start immediately. You could start it at work. You could start it with your kids. sure you do it with your kids. But you could definitely start it with your spouse. You could even start it over text. The next thing they say, you could say is good point, good question, good idea. Good point, good question, good idea. One of those is going to be relevant to most things that somebody says about fact. Even the stupidest thing. Your wife could be like, can you pick up Frosted Flakes on your way home? And you'd be like, good idea. We're running out. She'll be so surprised. She'll think somebody stole your phone. She'll wonder if you're cheating on her. She'll think you're a totally different man. But if she figures out that you're just trying to be nicer, your life will go a lot easier. Same thing for women. Women can be just as snide as men and as passive-aggressive, obviously. So the next time your husband says something that you think indicates a complete lack of knowledge about how the household works, why don't you answer him, and thereby you teach him how the household works, and that thing that he's so interested in can even become his specialty when he learns more about it. All right, guys, have a great day. Subscribe to this podcast. Subscribe to my Facebook group. I don't even know what I'm going to come up with next. I just have so many irons in the fire, and I will talk to you guys soon. Bye-bye.